This is Democracy Watch. All right, Mark, we are now on Supreme Court watch for the immunity decision, which may be handed down any day, moment now. Can you go over the potential outcomes of the case and the implications of each one?
Yeah, this is going to be the big blockbuster case of the Supreme Court term. And this is a term that has a lot of blockbusters. But we are all waiting with bated breath that this decision comes out. And there are really three things that could happen. Number one, the Supreme Court could say Donald Trump has immunity. You know, as he was the president of the United States, and presidents of the United States get to do whatever they want and can't be criminally prosecuted. Okay, so that's the full immunity outcome. Possibility number two, the Supreme Court says, immunity? Of course you don't have immunity. There's nothing in the Constitution that says presidents get immunity, even though there is something that says in the Constitution that says legislators get it. So by negative implication, they intended not to give it to presidents. And by the way, this conduct was not as president, right? So that's two. The third is they split the difference and they say, okay, presidents get immunity sometimes, and we really can't tell from the record whether this was that time. And so we send it back to the trial court for further proceedings. Okay, that's how you'll know. That's the term the Supreme Court will use. They will say it is remanded to the trial court, which just means it's sent back for further proceedings consistent with this opinion. And that will mean that the trial court has to weigh a bunch of factors that the Supreme Court lays out, and we will be back before the trial court to figure out whether or not the conduct at stake here was subject to immunity.
Now, I think by looking at this, that the whole reason the Supreme Court took this up in the first place was to grant Donald Trump the delay that he was so desperately seeking. And so consistent with that theme, it would strike me that the option they would go for, so as not to completely decimate the Constitution in this case by claiming that a president has carte blanche to commit criminal acts with impunity, the decision that I think they'll go with is remanding it back to the trial court. But I'm curious your opinion here as we await this ruling, what you think that they'll do.
Yeah, so look, when this issue first came up in the trial court and in the Court of Appeals, I thought it was a slam dunk, no immunity. I think the structure of the Constitution says no immunity. I think the fact they gave legislative immunity explicitly in the Constitution means presidents don't get immunity. And besides, I think that even if there were some areas where you would say there is immunity, for example, his role as commander-in-chief, his role in pardons, his role in vetoes, those are textually committed provisions of the Constitution. And the conduct here, you don't need a multi-factor test to figure out that none of those things are implicated here. So I would have originally said, and I would still say the right answer is no immunity. But, you know, we have seen a form of immunity that the Supreme Court has conferred here. It is immunity by delay. So Donald Trump has gotten immunity already by delay. And so I agree with you that if you follow the immunity by delay, and that is immunity both in how slowly they took the case, the fact they took the case at all, how slowly they took to hear the case, and how slowly they are in deciding the case. I mean, let's be clear, they didn't have to take the case to begin with. Right. Once they took the case, they could have ruled on it immediately. And number three, they could have scheduled argument immediately. Number three, they could have ruled immediately. So I think that they have decided on a delay immunity or immunity by delay. And that would lead us to that middle ground where they send it back to the trial court, even if the outcome is self-evident.
Now, I think that that's just what we know by virtue of knowing what we know about this court. But based on how oral arguments went, is there any indication as to how the Supreme Court might rule, aside from just what we know about their political persuasion?
Yeah, I think look, there were aspects of the Supreme Court argument that frankly were terrifying, and I don't scare easily. And I definitely don't, I don't back down from fights in court. I mean, anyone who sees me fight Republicans or conservatives in court, no, I don't get thrown for a loop easily. But I got to tell you, there were parts of this oral argument that were literally like in a bizarro land, because you had conservative members of the Supreme Court who were seriously engaging the question as to whether or not the President of the United States has total immunity. And so it would not shock me if we saw 1 to 3 justices wind up in that place, which on a court of 9 only leaves, not a unanimous decision and a narrower decision for a more middle ground. So I think we are looking at a middle ground. I think we are looking at an opinion that is ultimately probably written by Justice Comey Barrett, who seemed to be in that middle place, maybe maybe Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh in that middle ground, or the Chief Justice, who was clearly searching for that middle ground. Or maybe you see one of the three liberals decide that they want to try to author an opinion in the middle as, as a tactical decision. But I am not confident that we are going to have what I think the right outcome here, which is to laugh Donald Trump's position out of court.
Not great when the swing vote here is Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh.
Absolutely, and just to be clear, that is what the swing vote is. I mean, if you take the three liberals, right, you have to get to five. You take the three liberal justices, Sotomayor, Jackson, and Kagan, such as they are liberal. By the way, they are not, when we call them liberals, Justice Kagan is not really a traditional liberal. On a normal court, she would be considered a swing vote or a moderate justice, like in the Kennedy tradition. But by these days, we consider her liberal. Right. And then if you add the Chief Justice, you get to Coney Barrett as the swing vote.
Yeah, I guess when you're looking for justices who aren't flying insurrection flags, changes the calculus in terms of who's liberal. Everything is very relative on this court, I guess you could say. To that point, though, and I kind of say this tongue-in-cheek, but if the Supreme Court then does opt to rule in Trump's favor in any which way, what could Biden do as a result of that? What would you recommend that the next move taken by Joe Biden is? And I say that I ask this tongue-in-cheek because, we all know the respect that he has for the rule of law, but what should be the result of this on Biden's end?
See, this is the asymmetry we face ourselves. And I wrote a piece about this actually on Democracy Docket, that there is an asymmetrical fight for democracy going on right now, where Joe Biden is not going to let's say they came out with the strongest form and said total immunity. Joe Biden's not going to assassinate Donald Trump.
Right.
Joe Biden's not going to stage a coup. Joe Biden is not going to do the kinds of awful things that Donald Trump has put out a blueprint, or his allies have put out a blueprint in Project 2025. He's not going to do those things. So it's hard to say what he should do because he has too much respect for the Constitution. He has too much respect for the dignity of the office of president to stoop to those kinds of things. But people ought to be very, very worried about what this would mean for a second term, because even if you wind up in that middle ground with a balancing test, you know the saying, give an inch, take a mile. I mean, Donald Trump is give a centimeter and take 10 miles. And so Donald Trump is going to argue that any form of immunity will allow him to terrorize migrants in this country. He will use it as an opportunity to reinstitute the most draconian anti-abortion legislation, the Comstock Act, to invoke the Alien and Sedition Act to declare martial law. I mean, he will use whatever is given to him to the most extreme thing. And so I hope everyone who's listening to us is using this as an opportunity to make a plan to vote for Joe Biden and the Democrats, to make sure they are registered, to make sure their friends are registered, their family, and to put aside all of the other differences you may have with President Biden or the Democratic Party, but to preserve democracy by supporting them.
I think the asymmetry that you discussed is an especially cogent point, because basically what Republicans are giving themselves is more latitude that only they're willing to employ. And so they'll kind of create this precedent now that they know full well that no Democrats will employ, because Democrats have respect for the Constitution, rule of law, our institutions. And so they're basically just priming themselves to be able to eliminate the guardrails when they get into office because of Supreme Court, possible Supreme Court decisions like this one, knowing full well that it'll never be reciprocated by Democrats because they just won't do it. And so all they're doing is giving themselves the room, the runway to abuse the entire system, knowing that they're the only ones who are going to be able to do that.
Yeah. And also, by the way, I have been tried to be judicious in giving the benefit of the doubt to judges and justices. But there's also the question of whether or not, any ruling that they'd make here is like a good one time only for Donald Trump ruling, right? I mean, there was a case that came out of the Supreme Court in the last couple of days about a foreign tax, and I saw it and I'm like, wow, that's really surprising. I'm surprised the conservatives on the Supreme Court went along with taxing money coming abroad. And then I saw, oh wait, this was part of the Trump tax cuts. Yeah. And I had to ask myself the question, if this was Joe Biden who had done this, had put this tax provision in, would we have had the same outcome? And that is a terrible thing to ask, but you have to ask the question of, if would they hold the same immunity rules apply for a Democratic president? Joe Biden has had to walk on eggshells as he's gone through the tragedy of watching his son be part of the criminal justice system. He has had to stay out of anything that even appears to be influencing the Department of Justice. At the same time that Donald Trump says, I'm going to run the Department of Justice. I'm going to force political prosecution. So we see this double standard in many ways, and it has already infected our justice system. And, I mean, Brian, do you have confidence that the Supreme Court would rule as favorably for what a President Biden or another Democrat would do than what they do for Donald Trump?
Honestly, I think if an exact analogous case was brought to the Supreme Court, I think there would be very little stopping at least Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas from ruling the polar opposite just because the defendant's name would have a D next to his name as opposed to an R. To be perfectly honest, I don't think you have to change a single fact of the case, and I think that you'll get different rulings based on these people's political affiliations. Which, by the way, I think for those watching, if you are either you or have people in your life who may not be too keen on Joe Biden as a result of whatever it is, inflation, housing, Israel, Gaza, it doesn't matter what it is. This election isn't so much about Joe Biden as it is the future of the court, for example, because, if Trump wins again is able to appoint replacements for Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who are 75 and 74 years old, those people are going to sit on the court and entrench far-right control of the Supreme Court for the rest of our lives at this point, and they're certainly going to outlast Joe Biden. And so this election is not about Joe Biden. It's not about casting a vote to punish him. This is about us and the future of the country that we want to live in. So, of course, Mark, you had mentioned your piece on Democracy Docket on this topic. It was an excellent piece. For those who are watching right now, if you want to be able to read that or follow along with Democracy Docket, please make sure to sign up. It's the free news outlet he founded to focus on everything voting in elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.